to the second day of Vesak celebrations. Nous avons l'honneur de commencer le programme avec une table ronde sur le sujet de Sri Lanka et la culture bouddhiste. We are delighted to begin today with a panel discussion on Buddhist heritage and evaluating the past, Vesak, peace and harmony. J'ai l'honneur de donner la parole au vénérable professeur Mahinda Digale Thero, professor at Colgate University, a reader, the Bath Space University of the UK. It's my pleasure to hand over this morning session to Reverend Professor Mahinda Digale, professor at the Colgate University and reader of the Bath Space University of the UK. Venerable Professor, will you be able to come, please? And Venerable Professor Thero will be introducing the panelists and continue the panel session. Thank you.
Good morning, Venerable monks, nuns, excellencies, friends. Thank you very much for coming early in the morning. And we have a very interesting panel. The panel title is Vesak, Peace and Harmony, Thinking About Buddhist Heritage. And our panel is going to be about recent research in Sri Lanka. And in particular, we have two papers today. One paper about discovery of, or the dating of the historical Buddha in archaeological research in Nepal. The other one is a more contemporary topic, Buddhist reformer Anagarika Dharmapala and his contribution to recognition of Vesak. And I am moderating the session, and I plan to have this session until 10:15 in the morning. And then the two speakers, the first speaker will talk about 45 minutes and the second speaker talk about 25-30 minutes. And then we will have questions at the end. So thank you very much for coming, and there will be some questions period. So if you have any questions that to ask from the readers, even little bit simple questions is all right, because we would like to explain to you archaeology and history and anthropology. And so please write them down on a piece of paper, all your questions. And then if you cannot ask them directly, you can write down on a piece of paper and then send us, and then we can address them. So, and you can write them in Chinese also. That's all right, because we can ask someone to translate for us. Because we are very happy that Master Chen Kung and also Venerable Dr. Bodhagama Chandima Thero, and these two eminent monks are the ones who have made this possible. And the Vesak celebration made possible those two Venerable Pure Land Organization, and also Sri Nagananda International Buddhist University Sri Lanka, and also Samadhi International in Taiwan. And we are delighted to see a lot of people from Pure Land Organization, and thank you very much for coming. And also the acting ambassador and the staff in the Sri Lankan High Commission in Paris, and the permanent delegation to the United Nations, and also other embassies, Macedonia and also Madagascar, and these have been part of our co-sponsorship and participating and helping us and to make Vesak possible. We are very thankful. And also all the people who came here. And now, first of all, I will introduce our first speaker. That's Professor Robin Cunningham. And Professor Robert Cunningham's paper you can find in the book that you got yesterday. And it should be the chapter 4, I think. And he will be talking about Nepal. And Professor Cunningham is the UNESCO Chair in Archaeology at Durham University, UK. And he has studied archaeology and anthropology at King's College, Cambridge. And has done a PhD as a King's Scholar under late Professor F.R. Olchin. And he joined the Department of Archaeological Study at Bradford University in 1994 and became the Professor of Asian Archaeology and head of the department there in 2004. And then he moved to the very prestigious Durham University in 2005 and then became the head of the department in 2008. And most importantly, probably this is the only Provost Vice Chancellor we have, and he has served as a Pro Vice Chancellor of Faculty of Social Sciences and Health at Durham University. And most interestingly, he is a fieldwork archaeologist. Field research has done in Bangladesh, Nepal, Iran, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka on early historic chronologies and also investigating Iron Age and urbanization and Indian Ocean trade and archaeology of early Buddhism. And I did not mention here, but he has a book about Buddhism and archaeology published quite a while back, and very important work. And also, Professor Cunningham is very much at home in Sri Lanka and has done significant work in the ancient capital of Anuradhapura and had done a lot of fieldwork archaeology. And also he has done work in, along the Silk Route in Peshawar in Pakistan. And he has worked over 20 years, and he has worked over 20 years in UNESCO missions in various archaeological sites. And recently, the most recently, that's why actually he is here, because I was curious to know his cutting-edge research about identifying the date of the Buddha, because there are a lot of disputes within the last 30 years about when the Buddha lived, and we do not know when the Buddha lived, and usually it's about 750 to 500, 200 years period. And last 30 years, there's a lot of disputes about whether the Buddha lived in the 6th century, because Mahavansa and the Deepavansa says that, which is called Lone chronology, around 6th century. But some of the German scholars who have done research on the Greek inscriptions and the reference to Ashoka have thought actually it could be later. And so on the basis of the Chinese sources, people have dated the Buddha to 4th century. Now, Professor Cunningham's research kind of revisit that theory and try to argue that actually the Sri Lankan chronologies may be more accurate than the scholarly proposition, which is a very important thesis for our conference, because we are celebrating Buddha's birthday. So his most recent research is Lumbini, but also he's doing in Kapilavastu. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Cunningham, and we will have exciting moment of visiting history. And I welcome Professor Cunningham to address us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to start first by expressing my gratitude to Venerable Master Chin Kung of the Pure Land Learning College, also to the Venerable Chandima of Nagananda Institute, Venerable monks and nuns, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I was delighted to have the opportunity of joining you at Vesak, and this is the first that I have joined And I'm also very grateful to our panel chair, Professor Mahinda, who has been extremely careful in looking after us, and also in terms of the speed of the production of the volume and the care and attention. So for those of you who would like to pursue more about the presentation, it is there in black and white and also in color in the volume. The theme of the presentation that I'm going to make is one about education and also about research. And it's education and research in the area of the early Buddhist past. And the work that we've been undertaking has been in Nepal, at Lumbini, within the Mayadevi temple, the temple of the Buddha's birth, which was a privilege to work in. But as the Reverend kindly mentioned, I sort of cut my archaeological teeth working in Anuradhapura. And so what I would like to do is talk to you now about some of that educational mission that we've been following. Also, I must acknowledge the work of my co-investigator, Kosh Prasad Acharya, former Director General, Government of Nepal, who has been with me throughout the excavations and who has full responsibility for its findings as well. Before talking about the work, I feel I have to refer to the earthquakes of the 25th of April and also the 12th of May, because the cultural destruction within the Kathmandu Valley, pushing towards Gurkha, is absolutely phenomenally terrible. The loss of life, the loss of livelihoods is deeply worrying, but also we have an almost complete loss of some of the cultural heritage. This is the Hanumandoka Square. The ruins that you see here, this was actually the oldest living temple in Kathmandu, and now it is just a pile of rubble. Funding has come in to assist with the earthquake, but actually in terms of the reconstruction of living temples like this, the centers for people's ritual lives has not yet begun. So it will be decades before the rich ritual culture of Kathmandu is at all rehabilitated, a tremendous loss. Many of you may think why we need any form of research for an individual as well known as Siddhartha Gautama, known also as the Buddha. There are hundreds of books, there are many films. But actually, one of the elements which is interesting to an archaeologist and a historian is actually there is much discussion and debate, as our panel chair mentioned, about when he actually lived, whether it's the short chronology or the long chronology, whether he was born in the 7th or 6th century and whether he was born in the 5th century. And what we have is at his passing away, at his Mahaparinirvana, we have the instruction given to Ananda that 4 places were worthy of pilgrimage. Those were Lumbini, where he was born, Bodh Gaya, where he achieved enlightenment, Sarnath, where he first preached, and then finally Kushanagara, where his passing. And those sites were all rediscovered in the 19th century, but the debate is there that we have a long chronology and a short chronology. Some archaeologists, like Herbert Hartel, have said the opportunity of actually understanding more about this is almost zero, that the archaeology is so minute, the evidence that will be protected, that actually one does not stand a chance. And Beckhardt, a very famous German scholar, said actually there is no information on the date of the historical Buddha. So one might ask, why is this significant? Actually, it's significant because the period into which he was born was one of development, not evolution, but almost revolutionary development. The creation of cities like Rajgir, the introduction of coinage, of states, of kingship, and also the creation of heterodoxical sects, which were a way of allowing the new mercantile classes to break free in a way. So what is significant is when within this massive social and economic change actually did the Buddha and his teachings come through. The search for the sites connected with the Buddha's birth began in the early 19th century, mainly led by colonial scholars, but also with Nepali scholars. And there was very much an understanding that the Mahavamsa, the Dipavamsa, were parts of the keys to that. This is a slide taken from Kalenya Temple. But also the Chinese pilgrims, Fasen and Wanzang, both of them traveling in the first millennium AD, actually described the locations of those sites. And it's through their very detailed travel itineraries that all of the sites were discovered. What is also clear from those Chinese pilgrim itineraries was the role of the Emperor Asoka in the spread of Buddhism. And it is during his reign in 250 BC that Buddhism spread throughout South Asia, from Afghanistan down to Sri Lanka to Bangladesh. And indeed, we have a permanent record of that spread. Here at Lumbini, we have this pillar brought from the Ganges and inscribed by Asoka. And even in Pakistan, for example, we have one of the solid stone stupas built by the Emperor Asoka as part of his later patronage of Buddhism. And all of the sites associated with the life of the historical Buddha are up here, either in UP or Bihar, or just over the border in Nepal, in Lumbini, which is just shown here. And those sites were rediscovered mainly by Alexander Cunningham, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. And you can see from the 1830s all the way up to the 1890s, the sites, one after another, were discovered. Lumbini, the birthplace, was the last to be discovered. And here is the moment of the discovery of Lumbini. General Rana, who was the Nepali governor, and Dr. Fura, an archaeologist, met at a campsite. Next to the campsite, there was a mound of brick, and poking out from it was a stone pillar. They cleared the pillar, and that pillar has this inscription from the Emperor Asoka. Dating to 250 BC, it identifies this as the birthplace of the Sakyamuni Buddha. And also it mentions that Lumbini Game, the village of Lumbini, was released from tax. And this confirmed the site of Lumbini. And this is the original early Brahmi inscription of the Emperor Asoka. The first excavations were just clearing. P.C. Mukherjee and later others like General Rana's grandson, all they did was clear the rubble from the site. They did not investigate further, they just left the mound. And here is a photograph taken from an aeroplane in the 1960s of Lumbini. Here you have the Theravada temple, here you have the Sakya tank where Maya Devi washed, and this is the Maya Devi temple, a very simple place in the 1960s. And this is when U Thant, Secretary General of the UN, visited Lumbini and declared that this should be a suitable place of pilgrimage for world Buddhism. And that began to make a change. Previously, here again from the 1960s, pilgrims walked on foot. If they were wealthy enough, they traveled on an elephant. Even in the 1960s and 1970s, there were very few roads. In monsoon, they could not travel, and there was nowhere for them to stay. This is why U Thant wanted the site developed. So the UN actually commissioned a very famous Japanese architect, Kenzo Tange. And Kenzo Tange created a huge master plan measuring 3 miles by 1 mile. And in it, he created the journey of a pilgrim. In the northern part, there were museums, hotels, car parks. In the middle, there were monasteries. This was a monastic zone, divided by water, Theravada on one side, Mahayana on the other side, divided by the water. But right at the center, there was the tree on the old Maya Devi temple, surrounded by water, and in Kenzo Tange's mind, this should be the travel from the secular through the monastic to an inner quest for peace. And all of this was focused on the Asokan pillar. This was the concept that Kenzo Tange had. Now, in the 1990s, it became clear that the tree began to destroy the mound. Japanese Buddhist Federation and also the Department of Archaeology, Government of Nepal, undertook excavations to remove the tree and its roots and this mound. And they found underneath a rectangular building, and this was the shrine of the Emperor Asoka, the shrine that he built at the temple. And it measures about 20 meters by about 15 meters. And here you can have views actually of it during excavation. And this was very exciting, the first major discovery of an Asokan temple. This is a view of that in the year 2000, because there was a big debate as to how to create a suitable temple. And you can see it was a tin roof. There were very poor pavings around it. It was a very disappointing place for pilgrims to arrive in. In 2002, a new temple was built. But this is an area which has had increasing pilgrim numbers. Numbers have now reached about 900,000 pilgrims every year. Each pilgrim who walks inside the Maya Devi temple breathes out moisture, and that moisture has led to the deterioration of the Asokan temple. So I was involved with other colleagues, conservators and planners, in 2009 and 2010, because this white that you see on the brick is actually salt. Salt from the moisture of people's breath was destroying the brickwork. And here you have, this is the marker stone, and it's gone green because the moisture has led to the growth of algae. Therefore, it was very clear something needed to be undertaken, a mission needed to be put together, and luckily, the Japanese government, through the Japanese Funds and Trust for UNESCO, supported a project to utilize archaeology, conservation, and planners for a holistic approach. And so for 3 years, a team of us from Japan, from the UK, and also from Nepal and Italy worked together to work on the rehabilitation of the Maya Devi temple. And before the conservation could start, first the archaeology had to begin. And as I mentioned, some of the challenges we had were challenges that this is a living site. So whatever we did had to take into consideration the thoughts and the needs of pilgrims. So this was very much the first step towards identifying what I like to think of as sustainable pilgrimage. How to balance people's individual needs with the long-term preservation of the site. And it's important to stress that Lumbini is not just a site for Buddhists, but actually 40% of those who visit Lumbini are Hindus, and they worship at the site, and the majority of the farmers in the fields around are Muslim. So actually you have this huge mixture of needs and stakeholders. Our project was archaeology. I'm an archaeologist, so we undertook traditional excavation, but also we were doing mapping, we were doing geoarchaeology, we were also using geophysical survey. which without excavating, we were able to actually map what was below the surface. So, for example, here you see a field which is just green. When we did the survey, you can see this is an ancient road, here are ancient buildings. It's possible, without excavating, using new techniques, to actually identify bricks and structures and even whole cities below the surface. And this is important because with so many pilgrims visiting the site, 800,000, there need to be water, there needs to be shelter, there needs to be electricity. Where you choose to put those pipes, those services, is important, and you can use the archaeology to assist you with that planning. And so here is an aerial view of the Maya Devi temple. Here is the Asokan pillar. And so for 3 years, the team excavated inside, examining the foundations. And the brickwork you see here is the Asokan brickwork of the Asokan temple. And here you can see all our work was during the times when pilgrims were there, because we wanted to ensure that actually everything we did was fully visible. None of it was obscured or hidden. And these are my collaborating partners in Nepal, Kosh Prasad Acharya and Basanta Bidari from the Lumbini Development Trust. And so during that time, we actually excavated a series of trenches into the foundations of the Asokan temple to try and understand, was there anything below it, and also to try and understand where some of the water was coming from. And when we started excavating at the site, we found evidence. This is the Asokan brickwork here, so this is the Asokan temple. Underneath it, we began to find evidence of pre-Asokan occupation. So you can see this is a black mark here. This is actually cultural, and this is charcoal. As an archaeologist, you cut a trench, and then you look at the sequence, and this showed that when the Emperor Asoka had built his temple at Lumbini, he built it on top of a pre-existing temple. And so we began to try to analyze this, and also we used special dating methods. We used radiocarbon dating, where you can date a piece of bone or a piece of charcoal, and we also used something called OSL dating, optically stimulated luminescence dating, which measures the amount of radiation in sand. Because when sand is exposed to the light, it absorbs energy. When it's covered and buried below the ground, it slowly loses that radiation. Therefore, when you re-excavate it, you can measure how much radiation and therefore reach a scientific date. When we excavated, we were very surprised to find this is the Asokan temple here. You can see the foundations. We were surprised to find the Asokan temple was built entirely on top of an earlier temple built in brick. About 50 centimeters underneath the Asokan foundations, we found the floor of an earlier temple. And what was strange about this temple was right at the center of it, there was a void, somewhere without brick. And also what was important to note was actually the Emperor Asoka, when he built his temple, he did not damage these earlier foundations. His building was very carefully laid on top and built on top. So what we had was evidence of an earlier temple which the Emperor Asoka had carefully enshrined and built his own temple around. This is the central part, and you can see this is a pavement, and the pavement would have gone over here as well, and the pavement was marked by bricks standing on edge. And the bricks are massive. They measure 50 centimeters by 40 centimeters. Each one weighs 20 kg. This is a monumental structure below the Asokan temple. And here you can see again, this is the Asokan temple here, the foundations, and this is this huge Buddhist curb. These are bricks set on edge around the central portion of the temple, which had no bricks. So we had the central portion was defined, but actually was open, but then there was pavement beyond. These bricks are magnificent. If you think 20 kg is extremely heavy. And also you can see they even have people's fingerprints drawn across them. And this evidence is the first evidence of a pre-Asokan Buddhist temple. We do not know who built this temple, but we do know that it was exactly the same shape as the later Asokan temple. When we removed that curb of upright bricks, underneath it we found a line of post holes. Now, when you look at these, this is clay, and you can see these are circular. What has happened is someone has dug a hole, put in timber, later the timber has rotted, but what happens is it leaves a hole which then fills up with soil. So this sequence is quite unique. We have the Asokan brickwork here, we have the earlier pre-Asokan brickwork, and that is built on exactly the same plan as originally a timber structure. So we have a sequence that goes from timber structure to brick-built pre-Asokan structure to Asokan-built structure. And this dates to the 6th century BC, dated by radiocarbon dating, dated by optically stimulated luminescence dating, and as such, it is the earliest evidence we have. Now, if you begin to think about the shorter chronology and the long chronology, for a date for the creation of this shrine in the 6th century BC indicates that actually the longer chronology is the chronology which fits the archaeological evidence. And this evidence is quite unique. And also, many have suggested that, of course, the earliest Buddhist buildings would have been built in timber, then in brick, probably later in stone. This is a unique picture. We excavated in other trenches, and we found exactly the same sequence. Here you have Asokan brickwork, and then right down below you have these very large bricks from the pre-Asokan temple. Underneath that you have the timber structures, and underneath the timber structures you have evidence for farmland. So very, very early on, this was just farmland. Looking at the evidence from the Asokan temple, we began to find pieces of painted plaster. So it began to give us an idea that the Asokan temple had been painted with plaster. Also, we found roof tile. These are tiles, broken tiles from a roof. And it gave us an idea of what that looked like. Elsewhere within the temple, we found these very large bricks. Here you can see in trench C9 and here, although here the temple floor was damaged. In C12, this is the Asokan wall here. This is a perfectly preserved piece of the pre-Asokan floor here. So the Emperor Asoka just built his temple on top. This is the earliest brick-built Buddhist shrine that we have evidence for. In terms of the archaeological sequence, in the Asokan period, we have evidence of northern black polish ware, which is a very fine tableware. It's a luxury good. It's normally associated with the spread and patronage of the Emperor Asoka. Underneath that, we found pottery marked with cords, decorated with a matte impression and cord impression. This is a very vernacular style to this area. So the early activities, the early occupation of the site is linked to very much its own local region, and then later in the Asokan period, it becomes more of a luxury imperial center. Also, with this evidence, we can begin to reconstruct what did the early shrines look like. So, for example, here is the Emperor Asoka's temple. The center is open, so the original center is open, but we found tile in this area and in this area, not in the center, only around the edges. And this gives us an idea that actually this is purely a reconstruction. We're still working on it. But the center of the Asokan shrine was open. The roof was tile, the walls were timber, and they used plaster, and we know that they even whitewashed. So it gives us an idea of what this Asokan temple looked like. What about the Asokan horizon? The Asokan horizon is a period of monumental construction across South Asia, of brick and stone. The excavations gave us the opportunity to excavate below the Asokan horizon, what we call breaking the Asokan horizon. And we found all over the temple in the different trenches evidence of very large bricks. And so here you can see at the center, it was defined by a curb of raised bricks, and the other areas, it was a pavement, a very simple but monumental brick-built shrine. And here you can see this is the recreation of it, this very large platform, and right at the center, this open area. Again, the Emperor Asoka very carefully preserved this. And what about the earliest structure? We have a series of post holes, and this is quite close this is Dauni, quite close to Lumbini. This is a very simple shrine, a village shrine, with a tank and a tree and a railing around it. And so the earliest reconstruction we have of this structure is a very simple timber fence around a sacred space, which is then replicated in brick and then later by the Emperor Asoka. Now, what does this evidence show us? This evidence favors the long chronology. I used to be very keen on the short chronology because there was no archaeological evidence between the life of the Emperor Asoka and the earlier layers, almost nothing. Lumbini has given us this amazing opportunity, this privileged opportunity, of actually seeing the development of Buddhist architecture in its very earliest years, and favors the long chronology. This early structure dates to the 6th century BC, which favors the long chronology. In a way, we were very puzzled by the central space. Why was the center of the temple open? We undertook scientific analysis. We took a series of microscopic slides from the site. This is looked at under a microscope. And what we found was fossilized root, mineralized roots of trees. The reason the central portion of this shrine was open was because it was built around a tree. Now, in a way, this should be no surprise for those of you who know Sri Lanka well. You know Sri Mahabodhi is, again, a shrine built around the tree. Bodh Gaya was originally a shrine built around the tree. There are the very famous Sri Lankan tree and swastika coins. Here you can see a little tree with an enclosure. And even at Bahut, some of the earliest depictions of Buddhist architecture have tree shrines. We should not be surprised to find at the center of this structure, we should not be surprised to find a tree. And of course, it's one of those very rare moments when tradition, archaeological science come together to actually link with the Buddhist traditions of Mayadevi. Using the archaeological science, we are also now on the verge of identifying which species of tree, because here are the three main contenders: Ficus religiosa, Asoka, and also the sal tree. Each of these have different acids and fats within the tree leaves. When those decay in the soil, they leave the fats. The fats do not degrade. So by analyzing the soil and looking at the types of fatty signatures, you can actually even identify the species of the tree that grew there. So we hope within the next 6 months to actually have identified which tree was growing in the shrine. In addition to the work within the Mayadevi temple, we also worked in the ancient monastic area to the south of the Mayadevi temple. And there we found evidence of monasteries. Underneath them, we found evidence of timber structures. And we even found evidence of early monastic practice. This is an alms bowl. So we even found a beautifully preserved example of the alms bowl of a monk or a nun from the site. And also no animal bone and no manufacture within the area of the monastery. This is the village mound. If you remember, the Asokan edict mentions Lumbini Game, the village of Lumbini. And currently, there is a mound about 200 meters away from the Mayadevi shrine, which has a police station on top. This is built on top of an archaeological site. In the parade ground, we put an excavation trench 4 meters deep, and we found evidence that this village had been occupied by 1300 BC. So Lumbini was not a void before the birth of, or the life of the Buddha, but actually it was already a well-established village, the village of Lumbini. And we have evidence of it manufacturing, of its diet, and in the later years, it even produces oil lamps for the pilgrims visiting the Mayadevi temple. Now, I talked about Lumbini, but there is an equally important site that I've been working on with my Nepali colleagues called Tilarakot. And Tilarakot is identified as ancient Kapilavastu. So the Buddha was born in Lumbini, but then his childhood home until the age of 29 was the ancient city of Kapilavastu. This is Tilarakot when you visit. It's a mound, it's covered in grass, it has trees. For the pilgrim, it's very disappointing. Tilarakot was identified at the same time as Lumbini by P.C. Mukherjee, an archaeologist, using the travel descriptions of Farsan and Wanzang, the Chinese pilgrims, who said it is such and such a distance, such and such a direction from Shravasti to Kapilavastu to Lumbini. So this is how it was originally discovered. It was then excavated in the 1960s by Debla Mitra, who said it was not old enough to be ancient Kapilavastu. It was then excavated by teams from government of Nepal and a Japanese university who began to identify its western gate, its eastern gate, and a large building. And then over the last year, with funds from the Japanese Funds in Trust for UNESCO, who've generously support our work, with the support of the Lumbini Development Trust and the government of Nepal and my own university, Durham, we've started a new project at Tilarakot Kapilavastu. We've been doing mapping. This is an electronic distance meter, and this is a drone. The drone is wonderful. It goes up to a height of about 300 meters, and it maps the topography. So this is a plan of the ancient city. It measures about 400 meters by about 600 meters, and you can see it's rectangular. Here there are rivers, so we're doing topographic mapping. We also have been using geophysical survey. This is a magnetometer. You take one reading every 50 centimeters, and it measures how magnetic the ground is. If you have a wall of bricks under the surface, it is very magnetic. If you have mud, it is not magnetic. Using this, downloading it onto a computer, you get the most beautiful plans. Literally, you are seeing beneath the surface. So these areas are all the areas we are surveying, because here is a picture from the Arthasastra which suggests the city is not just defined by walls, but also by the monasteries and settlements around it. This is the survey of the city of Kapilavastu, and you can see, without excavation, we know there are roads, street map, and right at the center this year we discovered a walled palace area. So this is so exciting. This is just new in February, and next year in January we have permission with the UNESCO team to start excavating in the palace at ancient Kapilavastu. Inside the city we have evidence of beautifully built rectangular and square houses. We also have evidence of roadways. This is one of the roadways, and you can see it leads to the Eastern Gate, which is the Gate of Renunciation. And also we have civic architecture. In the center of the city, measuring 40 meters by 40 meters, here we have found a huge pond, a brick-lined pond at the center of the city. This is civic investment, rather like the ponds of the Kathmandu Valley. And also we are doing deep excavations because the levels on the surface date to the Kushana period, but down at the bottom are the timber structures that date to the lifetime of the Buddha. And this gives you some of the idea. Here we have very early timber structures, and here we have structures in the 7th century AD. So we have a very deep sequence. And we've even found evidence of the early fortification wall for the city, which was built in timber before later being built in brick. And most exciting, outside the Eastern Gate, there is a stupa. And this is the point of renunciation. This is where, at the age of 29, the Buddha left his family, his princely life. Under the fields, you just see, on top of the fields, you just see grass. Here is the geophysical survey. What you see here is an enormous monastery measuring 500 meters by 300 meters. It has viharas, it has shrines, it also has ponds. So we excavated here, we bought the fields of Dal, put in excavations, and we were very excited whilst excavating one of the vihars to find 498 silver coins, punchmark coins of the period of the Emperor Asoka. This is a very, very important shrine, previously unknown. To the south of the city, we found a huge industrial complex outside the city walls. So the ancient city was well planned, polluting industry was outside the city. And so we begin to understand there is a central palace, there is a monastery outside the east, a monastery outside the north, we think a monastery outside the west, and an industrial area in the south, and this palace area right at the center of the city. When you look at what our work has identified, it's very, very similar to the description of the ancient city by the Chinese pilgrim Fa Sen. Very, very similar, same topography. Our project continues, but of course this work does not mean the significance of Lumbini to pilgrims has changed in any way. Still, it is significant. And as I mentioned, it's significant for Theravada, for Mahayana, and also for Hindus living in that vicinity. It also has an economic significance. because this is one of the poorest areas of Nepal. Very low literacy, very high child mortality, very high unemployment. What is significant, we've been studying the movements of pilgrims. Most pilgrims spend less than 30 minutes in the sacred garden. Most of them come over the Indian border in an Indian bus. They bring their Indian packed lunch, they visit the site, they just leave rubbish. There is no social or economic benefit to those stakeholders and communities in the area. So we've been working with the stakeholders, with Buddhist communities, to actually begin to try and enhance the visitor and pilgrim experience, creating new pathways, areas to pray, so that religious and ritual activities can undergo, but without damaging the archaeology of the site. And we've been creating these risk maps. Red means do not excavate, do not put water or power lines. Green means these are the sensible places to put them. We've also been training officers from the University of Tribhuvan University, the Department of Archaeology, Lumbini Development Trust, and we've had observers. This is the new Director General of the Sri Lankan Cultural Triangle, Professor Gunawardena, visiting us, and we've taken officers to the UK because we believe that actually we can enhance the pilgrim experience and also benefit financially and economically and socially the local communities. This is Tillercoat with pilgrims from Taiwan, and we are also creating signs so there's more information, and also the government of Nepal is investing in museums to offer places to sell local handicrafts. Tour guides are also being trained from local villagers, stakeholders, who are already beginning to benefit from those communities. And also, many of the monuments that we've discovered are outside government control. So, for example, a portion of the new monastery we've discovered outside the eastern gate of Kapilavastu was destroyed by farmers selling soil. So completely destroyed. We have now given recommendations to the government of Nepal to protect and purchase this area, because all of this area is under threat from development, unplanned development. Development is good, unplanned development is not good. The potential for this region, the natal landscape of the Buddha, because of course this is not just the Sakyamuni Buddha's birthplace, this is also the birthplace of two other former Buddhas. So this whole area has huge significance, but most pilgrims only visit Lumbini. So we are working with the Japanese Funds in Trust to try and extend the information and the experience of the visitors and the pilgrims. And most importantly, we're trying to reach an understanding of sustainable pilgrimage, how to benefit local communities and stakeholders, and at the same time, how to present the sites. We work on very small budgets. We have been supported as well by the Hokkei Shu, which is a Japanese Buddhist association, so they let us stay in their monastery at Kapilavastu. And my own university is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That's Durham University, so we have a very, very close link with UNESCO. And our own World Heritage Site, our own World Heritage Site is both a university here, but also it is a cathedral. It is a living site with saints. Pilgrims come there. So many of the same challenges that the Christian cathedral and the university face are faced by colleagues in Nepal, colleagues in Sri Lanka as well. So looking together at the challenges, looking together at the solutions, we can begin, I think, to understand better how to reach this concept of sustainable pilgrimage. Finally, I have many, many colleagues in the published version who I have thanked, including our own very kind chair. And I am deeply grateful to the stakeholders, to the Lumbini Development Trust, to UNESCO, and also to the Japanese Funds in Trust for supporting this work, which, as I hope I've demonstrated, is not just research, is educational, and also may have an impact on changing people's lives and improving the social and economic environment in those areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for Professor Cunningham. And Professor Cunningham made his speech very accessible, and all of us could understand his scientific analysis, and perhaps it's much better than the one in the book. And you can find his article on page 56 onward in the book. And what is interesting is that, as Professor Cunningham said, that his research goes back to affirm the Sri Lankan dating of the Buddha, you know, the Deepavansa and the Mahavansa, and of course there are questions, but this is a welcome research, and I think a very important work, and we appreciate that you took time and came to share with us, and hope that we could do it again sometime, maybe the couple of us to next time. Thank you very much, and we will, yeah. And if you have any questions for Professor Cunningham, please write them down on a piece of paper, and we still have time a little bit later after Professor Kemper, and we will discuss it. And any questions, you're welcome. And now, I move to introduce our second speaker, Professor Stephen Kemper. Professor Stephen Kemper is a Charles A. Dana Professor of Anthropology in Bates College, Maine, United States. And we know his work, very important work, actually quite related with Professor Cunningham's work. His book is called The Presence of the Past, Chronicles, Politics, and Culture in Sinhala Life, actually concerned about Mahavansa, and much more how the Mahavansa related to national thinking, nationalism, and ethnic issue and things like that. And then he has other works. One is called Bind and Believe in Sri Lankan Advertising and Consumers in Transnational World. And that is 2001 from University of Chicago Press. And why he is here today is a personal reason. Because if you think about Sri Lanka, late 19th century and the 20th century, not only Sri Lanka, even India, as Buddhists, we cannot be proud without Dharmapala, Anagarika Dharmapala. Because without him, we would not be able to, of course there are negative sides, but positive side is he is the one who founded Mahabodhi Society, and who is kind of have very activist agenda to Buddha Gaya and Saranath and other places. And also he's a reformer in Sri Lanka. And I think his 150th anniversary is this year, birth anniversary, I think. And Professor Kemper has produced the groundbreaking work on Anagarika Dharmapala. Nobody else has done. So his new book is called Dharmapala, Rescued from Nation, Anagarika Dharmapala and the Buddhist World. Just came out 2-3 months ago from the University of Chicago Press. I recommend everybody reads it. And that's very groundbreaking work. And as Sri Lankans, and I think we should be very proud, because it's also very related to our topic, because we are celebrating United Nations recognition of Vesak, or Buddha's birthday, as an international holiday. And actually, the unsaid story, the story which is not visible, is it was the Anagarika Dharmapala who is the one actually the first initiator of that process, making affirmative and emphasizing that we have to protect the Buddha's birthplace, we have to protect the Buddha's enlightenment place, we have to protect the Buddha's place where he passed away, and so on. And so Anagarika Dharmapala did a lot. And so Professor Kemper comes today to say that actually Dharmapala was not only a nationalist, or some will call it, quote, is more racist, but actually he is a missionary. He's a missionary to take Buddhism away and also to make Vesak a missionary activity. So with that note, I welcome Professor Steve Kemper to tell us about Dharmapala.
Avasara, Aibuan, Namaste, Ni Hao, Salam Alaikum, Shalom, Hello, Alo, Hola. I'm going to try to pick up where Professor Cunningham left us. But less skillfully because I don't have a PowerPoint. So you're going to have to bear with me, and I will try to keep this as clear-headed as I possibly can and simply talk about Anagarika Dharmapala's extraordinary career. I think the takeaway from my talk this morning is the idea that Vesak is a product of many hands. Dharmapala certainly is a central figure, and an American Civil War officer, Henry Steele Olcott, is an important figure as well. But if you think about this holiday, this celebration, it has remarkable qualities of bringing the inside together with the outside, Buddhists with people who are not Buddhists. It has the quality of bringing Europeans together with ethnic Buddhists from Asia. It has the quality of bringing people of religious faith together with people who are simply impressed with the human qualities of the Buddha. And what I'd like to make the focus of my remarks is the process by which those various forces are brought together. If you know the name Dharmapala, Anagarika Dharmapala at least, you probably know it in reference to his struggle to regain control of Bodh Gaya. He made his first trip to Bodh Gaya in 1891. He traveled from Sri Lanka by train to Bombay, and he actually visited Sarnath first. He arrived in 1891 and to his dismay, found that the sacred place was in the possession of a group of Hindu world renouncers. They were Shaivites. They had a monastery on the edge of the Mahabodhi compound, and they had been there from the 1620s. They had a deed from the Mughal emperor from the 1720s, and they were in complete legal possession of a Buddhist place. It was an auspicious place, and one of the characteristics, I think, of South Asian religiosity is that auspicious places are auspicious independent of the particular figure who lives there. So Sufi shrines get visited by people who are Hindus or Christians or Buddhist, and likewise Buddhist places get visited by people who are Hindus. Dharmapala wanted Bodh Gaya, for obvious reasons, to be a Buddhist place, and there was no particular respect paid for the Lord Buddha at Bodh Gaya, and he launched the struggle to try to regain control of the place. He's known in Sri Lanka as the person who revived the Buddhist religion and Sinhala ethnic pride. He was himself Sinhala, the dominant ethnic group in Sri Lanka, raised in a Buddhist family, but educated in Colombo at a series of missionary schools. And he had a very negative experience in those missionary schools. He learned wonderful English. He learned the Bible, but he had a harsh reaction to the fact that the typically Catholic fathers, he didn't go to Protestant schools, he went to Catholic schools by and large. The Catholic fathers required him to pray several times during the day, and obviously that was hard for him to bear. So he plays a reformative role in Sri Lanka. He also becomes a missionary and carries Buddhism to India. He sets up housekeeping in Calcutta in the 1890s, and he spends 80 to 90% of his adult life living not in Sri Lanka, but living either in India or Japan or London. He was a world traveler, and he was always on the wing. He was going here and there on his attempt to make Buddhism present in the world. He was a missionary, but he was a very peculiar sort of missionary. He had no interest in converting people, and that resistance to converting people was a reaction to his experience in those missionary schools that he was educated at. So in the course of his lifetime, he is identified with the conversion of two Westerners. He didn't really propagandize them or even convert them because he wasn't a Buddhist monk and he was not entitled to convert people. But many people in the late 19th and early 20th century who became Buddhists did so by their own self-conversion, not with the intervention of the Mahasangha, but by way of a simple change in self-description. That's the case with Henry Steele Olcott, and he's the second figure I need to talk about before I get myself launched here. Olcott was a man who served in the Army of the Potomac, fighting in the American Civil War in the 1860s. But by the 1870s, he had become a theosophist. Theosophy, if you are not aware of this eccentric Western religion, was the masterwork of a woman who was a Russian aristocrat. Her name was Helena Petrovich Blavatsky, and she and Olcott, who became the administrative force in the Theosophical Society, started a movement. She started in Europe first, and then she moved to New York, and Olcott joined her in New York, and they became interested in the wisdom of Eastern religions and in Buddhism in particular. Later theosophists like Annie Besant were much more interested in Hinduism, but Olcott and Blavatsky were in favor of Buddhism as being the summation of all Asian religion, and they traveled to Sri Lanka in 1880. They arrived at Galle. They took the Triple Refuges, and they had several visits to Sri Lanka. Blavatsky passes out of the scene. Olcott becomes the great spokesman for Buddhism, and a man who's an American, but an American Buddhist, and he organizes things in Sri Lanka so that the Buddhists can fight back against the Christians. He establishes a printing press. He buys a Christian missionary printing press, rehabilitates it, and puts it to Buddhist use. He has fancy bazaars. He has periodicals. And he is assisted in this work by Dharmapala, who is a young boy at the time that Olcott arrives. Olcott is in his middle 40s, and Dharmapala is 16. So the two of them go out to a variety of Sinhala villages, and they preach Buddhism. Olcott preaches, and Dharmapala translates. They travel by bullock cart. They sleep at night in the bullock cart. They go from village to village, and that becomes the pattern of both of their missionary work, but eventually Olcott retires and Dharmapala takes over the charge. In 1884, Olcott, who had close relationships with the British government, convinced the governor of Ceylon that Vesak ought to be a national holiday, a public holiday, celebrated the same way Christmas was so enthusiastically celebrated in Sri Lanka. And that's the beginning of this rejoining of the celebration to the public sphere and to the colonial government. Vesak starts out in ancient Anuradhapura in a very different form. It is an auspicious time. It is the full moon day of the month of Vaisakha, the second month of the Indian calendar. And it's a time when Devanampiyatissa was consecrated. It's the time when the foundation stone for the Mahatupa was laid. It was a time when later kings of Sri Lanka would offer robes to the monkhood or would offer acts of charity to the poor. So it's not exactly a birthday. It is an auspicious day, but under colonial circumstances, the Western practice of celebrating birthdays is joined to the South Asian practice of celebrating auspicious times, taking action on auspicious times, and modern Vesak is a combination of those two things working at the same time. Dharmapala carried Vesak to India with him, and he celebrated the first Vesak in 1896. So in Calcutta in 1896, Dharmapala, who had been there for a number of years, got his supporters together and they celebrated Vesak. His supporters were the Bengali Bhadralok, that is the well-to-do, high caste members of the local elite. They were Bengali by ethnicity and they were Hindu by way of religion, but they took part in that first Vesak ceremony in some ways because they were theosophists. So the connecting link between his Indian supporters and the celebration of the Buddha's birthday in 1896 was the fact that he had a constituency when he arrived in Calcutta, and that constituency was made up of people who were impressed by the great regard that Blavatsky and Olcott had for Asian religions. They were among the very first Westerners to recognize the deep thinking of Asian religions in general and Buddhism in particular. And Olcott was a man who was simply a very good person. He treated Asians as equal. He thought he could learn things from Asians, and he had a deep affection for Buddhism, which naturally looked very good against the background of the British Raj in India and in Sri Lanka. So he had Asian friends, and those friends were eager supporters of Dharmapala when he got to Calcutta, and they were eager supporters of Vesak when he had that first ceremony. Dharmapala's great Calcutta supporter was Narendranath Sen, who was the editor and the founder of an Indian newspaper called the Indian Mirror, and it was the largest Indian newspaper, that is, the largest Indian-owned newspaper in India at the time. And Narendranath Sen became Dharmapala's supporter and organizer and launched him on his first addresses at the Albert Hall in Calcutta and helped him organize that first Vesak. I mentioned Sen, who's less centrally involved than Olcott. because that first Vesak was celebrated for a whole set of reasons that were not particularly religious. They had to do with seizing upon the figure of the Buddha as a symbol of Indian national identity, because from the 1890s onwards, forward-thinking people in South Asia began to suspect that there was going to be an end to the British Raj. There was going to be a time when there would be an Indian nation, and it was well to put in place some national feelings, and the Buddha was an instrument for instilling national feeling in the hearts of people who were not themselves Buddhist. This is what Sen said on that occasion. The nation that continuously thinks of its great departed, reflects on their actions, meditates on their virtues, and regards them as ideals for contemplation and imitation, must itself become in time great, virtuous, and happy. We had a great past, a past which has slipped out of the memory of most of us. We make pilgrimages and visit sacred shrines, but we worship the places rather than the blessed ones who gave them their sanctity and fame. Our worship has been lip service, a mere babbling formality. Why should we then wonder at our utter debasement, both as individuals and as a nation? So that first Vesak celebrated in India, Dharmapala said it was the first Vesak in 700 years, and it remains to be seen whether the holiday was celebrated in the late Buddhist period, but a reasonable guess. There was a 700-year absence. That first Vesak celebrated in Calcutta was turned toward instilling in people a sense of national identity and not exclusively venerating the virtues of the Buddha himself. This was a time in Indian history when Hindus began to think of their historical predicament, which is, how did we end up with the British on our case? How do we end up losing our independence? How do we end up being poor in the hands of the richest nation in the world, which is getting richer still by virtue of its ability to exploit the industrial power, the human power of the Indian people? One of those figures who was interested in using Buddhism as a tool for national regeneration was Swami Vivekananda. Vivekananda and Dharmapala had met in Chicago at the World Congress of Religions in 1893. Vivekananda stayed on in the United States, and Dharmapala moved on to India. So Dharmapala carried the Buddhist cause forward in Calcutta, and he did so in the midst of people who were interested in Buddhism, although not themselves Buddhist. They saw the predicament as a period of decline that had set in, and people like Narendranath Sen dated that decline. People like like Vivekananda, I should say, dated that decline to the period when Buddhism was disappearing from India, and consequently, forward-thinking progressive figures in Indian intellectual life saw the religion, saw Buddhism as the religion that could restore a kind of national pride and make connections between India and the world beyond. Vivekananda always believed that the Vedas were the summation of human wisdom, but he saw the Buddha as the historical embodiment of that wisdom. He would have regarded the Buddha as a Hindu. He would have regarded the Buddha not as the founder of a new religion. That was the great mistake, according to Vivekananda, that the Buddhists got into the business of separating their religion from Hinduism, and the consequence for Indian life was a wall of custom got built around India, shutting off all interaction between India and the larger Buddhist world that surrounded India on several sides. And India's decline was a product of that closing in of Indian sensibilities. Vivekananda saw Indians' regeneration as a matter of recognizing the great virtues of the Buddha, which he understood as a Hindu and not the first Buddhist. I want to go on to the celebration of Vesak in other parts of the world, but I'll just mention in passing that the Dharmapala celebrated Vesak in Japan in 1902. Dharmapala traveled around the world either 4 or 5 times, depending on how you count some of those trips. He visited Japan 4 times, and he had a group of members of the Mahabodhi Society in Japan who supported the cause, but they were really much more interested in supporting Mahayana Buddhism than Dharmapala's own brand of Buddhism. But in 1902, he celebrated Vesak in Tokyo, and shortly thereafter, there were Vesak ceremonies in Lahore, which was a partially Hindu city at that time, in Chennai, in Kusinagara, in Lumbini, an appropriate place to be celebrating the Buddha's birthday. And by the early 20th century, there were Vesak ceremonies being celebrated in London. I want to move on to London as my second case in point and talk about the motivations and the many hands, the many minds part of the early celebration of Vesak in a Western country. Dharmapala was the first Buddhist missionary in the modern period. I've already said he was an unusual kind of missionary, but he wanted to make Buddhism present in the West. But there were other Buddhists who were already at the cause. There was a British soldier who I think by the first decade of the 20th century was preaching Buddhism from a soapbox in Hyde Park. There was a Buddhist society formed in London in 1909. So Dharmapala had been in England several times on his world tours, but he hadn't really spent any considerable amount of time in England. There were English Buddhists. They formed a Buddhist society, and they began to celebrate Vesak. That Buddhist society regarded itself as a secular organization, that it was not a religious organization, and the people were not themselves necessarily Buddhists. They were people who were interested in Buddhism. They were scholars like Carolyn Rice Davids. They were Sri Lankan Buddhists who happened to be living in London. There were British Buddhists who were interested in Buddhism, oftentimes by way of theosophy, and there were people who were simply struck by the uncommon good sense of the Buddha and saw him as a world historical figure, independent of his being the founder of a religion. In 1910, the Buddhist Society of London celebrated Vesak, and the president of the Buddhist Society said, "This is not a celebration of the Buddha's birthday, this is just an appreciation of the Buddha." So it's not entirely clear to me why he would be resistant to the idea of celebrating the birth date of the Buddha, but recognize that Vesak gets going in the West by way of Westerners who bring their own interests to the encounter and who understand it in ways that wouldn't be recognizable in many parts of Asia. Dharmapala arrives in the UK for an extended stay in 1925, and he brings with him the Mahabodhi Society, and the Mahabodhi Society has the annual celebrating of Vesak. If you look at photographs of those early ceremonies, the people who attend are a wide array of different kinds of people. The Thai ambassador is the authority figure. There are well-to-do Sri Lankans who are living in London. There are interested British Buddhists and British supporters of Buddhism who probably have not declared themselves as Buddhists. And there are Hindu ladies, there are Burmese ladies. There's a roughly 50-50 split between the Britishers and people from Asia celebrating those first Vesaks in the late 1920s in London. So in both the Indian case and in the English case, Vesak begins as an occasion where people who are not themselves Buddhists have a central place in the celebration of the Buddha's birthday. I want to finish by just suggesting two reasons why that might be the case. Why it might be the case that outsiders who are not Buddhist would be interested in celebrating Vesak. Until 1911, Vesak, by the way, was the celebration of the Buddha's birthday. It had no association until 1911 or after 1911 with the triple events that happen on the full moon day of the month of Vaisakha, namely birth, enlightenment, parinirvana. 1911 was the 2,500th anniversary, locally understood, of the Buddha's birthday. When we get to the Buddha Jayanti in 1956, 1956 is 1911 plus 45 years. So you take the 45-year ministry of the Lord Buddha and you extend the celebration of the Buddha Jayanti into the future, which quite fortuitously becomes the early period of independence in Burma and in Sri Lanka, and it's an appropriate time for taking Buddhism much more seriously. I want to talk about how it is that insiders and outsiders produce Vesak as a celebration by suggesting two reasons why it is an occasion that can bring together all manner of people around the figure of the Lord Buddha. I think the first reason is entirely straightforward. It is that Buddhism can be a cosmopolitan, inclusive occasion because the Buddha was a cosmopolitan and inclusive kind of figure. He was preaching his message to people who were not themselves Buddhists necessarily. He was in the business of being a Buddhist missionary, and he was able to do what people in the social sciences call take the other. He was able to put himself in the shoes of other people and see the world from their position. And that in itself suggests a kind of impartiality that makes Vesak an occasion that's attractive to people who are simply brought to the event by virtue of some sense that the Buddha is a figure who needs to be taken seriously no matter what religion you happen to practice. The second suggestion I would make about why it is that Vesak can be a celebration that includes outsiders as well as insiders has to do with the character of the kind of Christian celebrations that were in the background when Olcott and Dharmapala did their work in Sri Lanka and beyond. Olcott had it in mind in 1884 that the celebration of Vesak in Sri Lanka would be roughly comparable to Christmas. That is, it would give the Buddhists some public visibility. It would give them recognition that was woefully absent before 1884, that the religion of the majority community was a religion that didn't count in Colombo, and that the hegemony of Christians who were British or who were well-to-do Sri Lankans made it very difficult to count yourself as a serious person in Colombo as late as the 1890s. So Olcott's innovation was simply to bring Buddhism into the public sphere. And Dharmapala carried that on when he brought it to India. He saw Vesak as an occasion for making the Buddhism present after that 700-year absence in India, and he saw it as a way of showing proper respect for the Buddha himself. In some ways, I think it's a more useful analogy to think about Vesak against the background of Easter, and that's my last point here in trying to point out what makes Vesak attractive. Easter is an occasion for Christians to take seriously the sufferings of Christ. If you know the Roman Catholic practice of the 12 stages of the cross, Christians on the occasion of Easter are asked to relive 12 moments leading up to the crucifixion of Christ in a way that is deeply experiential and obviously genuinely felt. Vesak is not like that. Vesak is not the reliving of the Buddha's birth. It's not the reliving of the Buddha's enlightenment. It's not the reliving of the Buddha's passing away. It is simply remembrance of the Buddha. It's celebration of the Buddha. And because of that, it's very easy for people who are outsiders to regard themselves as insiders on the occasion of Vesak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kemper. It's a very important contribution to present Dharmapala as a very cosmopolitan, globalized citizen of the world. And definitely he places his stamp in every corner, in Sri Lanka, India, Japan, and in London, in all continents except Africa. Now we had got one wonderful presentation. Thank you. And we have few minutes for questions. The procedure is, if you have written down questions, you can raise your hands or pass the questions to that lady on the corridor there at the end, or there should be a microphone there. But if there is anybody has any questions, please come forward and we will provide you a microphone. Okay, that gentleman there on the right-hand side, yes, please.
我请教一个问题，在这佛祖诞辰的纪念日和大德高僧云集的此地，我请教一个问题：释迦牟尼佛祖讲的佛教的信仰对象如来的真实含义，是一个很重要的问题。我想请教一下，这个指的如来是谁，在哪里？谢谢。
Someone needs to translate it into English.
Good morning. He wanted to ask the true meaning of Buddha, and actually the translation, the Chinese translation of Buddha is 如来. Sounds like this, yeah. So he wanted to know the meaning of 如来 or the Buddha.
I think the question is not for the panel, but usually Buddha means it comes from the Sanskrit root Bud. Bud means to awaken or wisdom. So the Buddha is just an attribute. It's not his real name. Because he got Satori or enlightenment or Buddhahood, or because he awakened himself, or he became wiser, or he found the wisdom. So because of that root called Bud, to know, so he's called awakened one. So the Buddha is an attribute. He's not real name. His real name is Siddhartha, which means the one who has accomplished his aim. Siddha Artha. Siddha means accomplished, Artha means meaning. So Rui Lai, maybe it's the same meaning. Rui, I don't know what Rui means, but maybe the king of the law, maybe probably. I don't know. But I think it is not for the panel. But any question about Lumbini or Dharmapala, welcome. Yes, please. Are you speaking in Chinese or in English?
I think I can speak in English. My question is to Professor Robin Cunningham. Professor, I'm also coming from Durham University, and my major is in intercultural studies and the Chinese language and English. I'm very pleased to listen to your speech about through the archaeological evidence to decode or find out the birth of the Buddha. My question is about you. I know you have lots of research in this area in South Asia. I wonder if you have any plan of further project about, extend your research into Southeast Asia, into the Silk Road, which, have a lot of culture exchange between China and the Western countries. And also this is we have nowadays have like the economical Silk Road way promoted by by Chairman Xi Jinping, and so this kind of research might be very, very important. So I wanted to know whether you have such kind of plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. In terms of the approach, my view is that the way we recognize archaeology needs to change, because for many years archaeology was a rather restrictive role of just clearing buildings, presenting and not moving forward. Last year in Lumbini, there was an international Buddhist conference supported by the Theravada Academy of Nepal and also an academy in Myanmar. And a series of resolutions, as often you get in conferences, were made. But these were fascinating because they held the resolutions that pilgrims have a social and economic responsibility to the communities around them, Buddhist and non-Buddhist, but also that scientists have a responsibility to translate their work into more accessible language. And thirdly, that actually we need to, in a way, recast and reinterpret what we mean by the archaeology of Buddhism. Because specialists and non-specialists, lay and scientists and religious need to come together in that sort of very rare event. That's one of the few events. So in terms of the program of work, I have some hope that the UNESCO chair will now give us the framework, and we were only awarded the UNESCO chair in November. So, and I've only just escaped from being a Pro-Vice-Chancellor. So my hope is, actually, we will begin to first work within SARC. So we have very close links with the Postgraduate Institute of Archaeology, University of Kelaniya in Sri Lanka, MS University in Baroda, Hazara University in Pakistan. And so what we're hoping to do is to create the use of what I would call field laboratories to offer a training program, exchanges, observer. My own academic framework, I have a barrier intellectually the moment I cross into the Bay of Bengal. So I realized that I am very interested in the transmission of ideas, Indian Ocean trade, and the Hindu belief, Buddhist belief. I believe that actually these new scientific technologies can transform the way we understand the sites. And Buddhist Pilgrimage, Asia Development Bank, is predicting there will be 22 million pilgrims in South Asia in 6 years, annual visits. The sites as they are will be overwhelmed by numbers, which is why I would say the top priority is to try to protect and to preserve and to present correctly the sites under most threat. So next week I am planning to go on a UNESCO mission to Myanmar, because there the development in Bagan is beginning to threaten the subsurface archaeology. And my position is, what you see above the surface you can protect, what you cannot see below the surface you tend to ignore, and that gets damaged. But actually, the work at Lumbini and Tiruakot Kapilavastu indicates the subsurface archaeology is as significant, if not in some cases more significant, than the standing monuments. So I'm committed to facilitating a network of interested scholars. So if you can identify for me potential partners who would like to participate in this network, I'm very, very interested in actually promoting this approach, because I believe the next 6 years will be critical for the long-term preservation of sites. Otherwise, if the pilgrim numbers increase, the sites will be destroyed. So thank you for a very, very accurate and probing question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cunningham, for this insightful response. And we are coming to a close our panel, and our Minister Kadu Jayasuriya has arrived, so probably he needs space to deliver the address. So today I'm very thankful to Professor Cunningham and also Professor Kemper for writing 2 important chapters, one about excavation in Lumbini, which is very crucial, which kind of go back to Sri Lankan tradition, Mahavansa and Deepavansa, which is very important. And then Professor Kemper's paper highlighting the role of Dharmapala as a very important figure in the Buddhist world. And so these 2 papers have contributed significantly, and I'm thank both of you. And also I must thank Venerable Master Chin Kun and Venerable Dr. Bodhagama Chandimatero and his young members of the monks who have been very supportive, and also the Sri Lankan permanent delegation to the UNESCO, and also Master Chin Kun's members of the Pure Land College, and then the missions of Madagascar and Macedonia, and all those, and also the monks in Paris, you know, venerable monks in the Sri Lankan temples in Paris. And thank you very much, and we hope to see you again next year probably. Thank you.
Venerable professors, thank you very much for these enriching insights into Buddhist heritage and the tradition of Vesak. I would now like to invite the Venerable Dr. Bodhagama Chandima, head of Nagananda International Institute for Buddhist Studies in Sri Lanka, to come up on stage and present a token of thanks to our participants for their contributions this morning. Thank you very much, gentlemen.